Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are looking at Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, which is part of the paper on English literature from 1590 to 1798. I am Anna Kurian and I teach in the Department of English at the University of Hyderabad. We are considering Thomas Gray today as part of a movement which eventually moves us from the neoclassical age into the Romantic age. So the last 40 years of the 18th century, when Gray was doing his writing, is called the pre-Romantic age, or the age of sensibility, or the age of transition, because effectively it transitions from the neoclassical or the Augustan age into the Romantic age. And so we see that shift happening at various levels also within the poetry as well as amongst the poets who are working during that period. Alongside Thomas Gray, we also should be considering somebody like William Blake, who also is a part of this transitional movement. Now, at this point in time, if the neoclassicals were ruled by rationalism and by a social commentary kind of poem, here you have something which is more to do with emotion, which more to do with the individual, and of course more to do with the idea of the solitary genius. Now, whether that solitary genius is later on going to be Wordsworth wandering amongst the daffodils or walking around in various settings, at this point in time, we see that movement taking place. And Gray is particularly important because, especially in this, his best-known poem and his most anthologized poem, we see that movement from the crowd to the individual taking place. This is also, of course, when we have the Graveyard School of Poetry in English. Now, as the name itself suggests, the Graveyard School, something which is somber, something which is dark, something which dwells upon the ideas of death and so on and so forth, and uses that graveyard, the ideas associated with the graveyard, to think about human life and mortality. And Gray's elegy, written in a country churchyard, is emblematic of this Graveyard School of Poetry, is the culmination also of this trend of poetry during the period, other examples of which you can read about in the lesson itself. Now, Thomas Gray, we'll very briefly go over his life and works. He was born in 1716, educated at Cambridge, and he was friends with Horace Walpole. Now, Horace Walpole, a political figure, but also a significant literary figure of the period. And he was also friends with several of them. Later on, when we do the unit on Samuel Johnson, you will hear about him once again over there. But here now we are talking of him as a friend to Thomas Gray. Now, Thomas Gray also went off on the grand tour, but then did not complete it, and eventually returns and settles in Cambridge. Like a lot of the early poets in English did, he also began writing in Latin before moving into English. Interestingly, about Gray, the fact remains that he never really fulfilled the potential that he displayed. And there's always this kind of uncertainty about his work. That is he really a truly great poet to be ranked alongside, say, somebody like Alexander Pope or William Blake, of course, one of the greatest of English poets, or even the later Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, Coleridge, the Romantic poets. And he seems to occupy a rather nebulous kind of setting and nebulous position in English literature, because he does not quite fit in anywhere, nor does he have a very large body of work. Much of the work that he did, he refused to publish it, or he refused to complete it. So all of it is kind of incomplete, and his life itself seems to display this kind of uncertainty and hesitancy that is also then seen in his work. His earliest English work is one, of course, the sonnet to the death of Richard West. Now, Richard West was his closest friend and life companion, shall we say. And once he dies, he then goes into this kind of elegiac mode. And though Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard is supposed to be not about one specific person, even here people have found echoes of his devotion to Richard West. And he also wrote other poems, Ode to Spring, Ode on a Distant Prospect of Eton College, etc., etc. All of them set in very specific forms, so the ode, the elegy, the sonnet, and so on. So displaying a certain technical expertise, which was also wedded to an emotional expertise, but yet success came to him only when eventually he published the elegy itself in 1751. And the elegy was published not because he wanted to publish it, but because others were publishing hacked versions of it, and so finally he gave in and published it. Now, amongst his last works are two Pindaric odes, The Bard and The Progress of Poesy, and The Progress of Poesy still has some currency, but eventually, of course, he dies at the age of 55, and he is buried in a churchyard, which is also supposed to be the setting for the poem that we are going to be looking at today, the Stokes churchyard. And the elegy itself is supposed to have been set there. So what we see in the poem is also where he is eventually buried. And this later on we'll see how this has a particular resonance, because the last three stanzas of the elegy itself are supposed to be his own epitaph. So he is buried where he wrote about his own epitaph as well. Now, first of all, the elegy begins with three stanzas which set the scene for us. And let's briefly read them aloud. Elegy written in a country churchyard. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Now, those four first lines of the poem, where you have the curfew which tolls the knell of parting day, basically you're being told that the day is ending. And the cows are returning home with their cow herd. The ploughman is going home. And notice, of course, that he plods his weary way. There is tiredness in everything. Everything is ending. People are going home wearily, having worked through the day. And what is left? The world is left in darkness. And in that darkness, there is one figure, the figure of the poet. Now, usually when we think about elegy written in a country churchyard, we are also used to thinking about the speaker as being Gray himself. Now, that is not necessarily true, that the speaker is equal to Gray. The speaker is the speaker, and then there is Gray. So when we listen to that last word of the first stanza, leaves the world to darkness and to me, the me is not necessarily Thomas Gray, but could be the speaker of the poem as well. Then, of course, he goes on to set the scene in the rest of it, that the glimmering landscape is fading out, and all the air a solemn stillness holds. Notice, if you will, the alliteration, which is a common feature of practically every stanza. And as he goes on and on, he tells us that finally over here the owl is coming out to complain to the moon. So darkness arrives, then the moon rises, the creatures of darkness come out of the darkness, and there you have a scene which has been set in a churchyard, but also in utter darkness and night. And there you have a moon, you have ivy, you have beetles, you have owls, and so on and so forth. But you also have a solemn stillness. So night is then characterized as being still, as being quiet and not moving. There isn't much movement, even though you hear the moon and you hear all of that, but there isn't much movement. There is a solemn stillness which grabs hold of the night and of the poet who's speaking, as well as us, the listener. So the first three stanzas, as we've just seen, set the scene for the poem, and the darkness is all encompassing. The poet is alone in the churchyard, which is fine. The poet is all alone, but there are creatures. So there are beetles and there are owls, as we've seen. There is a moon rising. The mood that is evoked for us by these three first stanzas is one of course, quiet meditation, but also of tranquility, as in there is peace. When he says in that first stanza that, or in the second stanza when he says that this solemn stillness, that is quiet, but it is not a quiet which is depressive. It is a quiet which is solemn, which is serious. And then, of course, there is this melancholic idea which pervades the poem. This we see as we proceed rather than right here. It is not so common in the first three stanzas that we've just read. But as we go through the poem, we can see then that there is a certain melancholy which accompanies it. That melancholy is also because, of course, of the setting. I mean, if you are standing in a churchyard, a graveyard, surrounded by graves on every side, then you're not likely to be bouncing up and down and dancing in cheerfulness. You are going to be serious, solemn, considering the idea of human life and death, because all around you are the souls of the dead. Now, it is with this background that we begin to read the poem. And as you read this following stanzas, it's a fairly long poem. There are about 30 to 34 stanzas, and each of them having 4 lines and so on and so forth. Now, as you read the poem, what you see is that the first few stanzas tell us about the lives of the people in the village where this country churchyard is. When we say a country churchyard, we're not talking in terms of country as a nation, but country as in the rural countryside. So it's a village churchyard that we are looking at, where the speaker is standing and telling us his thoughts in poetry. And what we see is the lives of the villagers. Their daily routine, their everyday lives are given to us in the poem itself. But, and this is where it starts becoming a little more interesting, he tells us that here there are people who have gone to work, come back. Here there are people who are working at home, so the women are working at home. There are children who are running around kissing their parents and so on, because the day is ending and so on and so forth. And even as we are told about the daily routine of the villagers, and we are also told that don't scorn these people. These are humble people, these are simple people, and the ones who are listening to him or who are hearing him should not then scorn the humble lot of those who are buried here. And the stanza that is specifically relevant over here goes, let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. So he's got two parts to this. One is, of course, that the poor people, and if you notice, village life or the countryside life is also a life of poverty. It is not necessarily a life of great wealth where everybody is enjoying rural life, right? But he says their life stories, their annals are short and simple. There isn't any great complication. There is no complexity about their lives. Their joys are simple. Their joys are homely. Their destinies are obscure. As in, their lives are lived out in a certain obscurity. Nobody really knows about them. All their lives look like each other's lives. It's not as if they have particularly stunning lives which are then celebrated by everybody else. And yet he says, ambition should not mock their useful toil. It's something that we are often used to forgetting, that if they were not there in the countryside, living their lives of humble toil or useful toil, we would not have the food that we eat, the milk that we drink, and so on and so forth. There would be no farming activities, there would be no dairy farms, and therefore then life as we know it in the city would not take place. So when he says, let not ambition mock their useful toil, we are also being asked to remember that it is because they work in the countryside, it is because they work in the villages that we enjoy the lifestyle that we do in the cities. So their destinies might be obscure, but we of course have a greater destiny. There is also this implicit in the poem, there is this understanding that people in the city look down upon people from the countryside. And that scorning of, or that pride in the life of the city, is something which the poet is not endorsing over here. He goes on then, after talking about their usual everyday routines, and after talking about how we should not scorn them, he goes on to talk about the idea that grand memorials are not necessary for the dead. This is again funny because a churchyard depends upon memorialization. As in a churchyard, you have tombstones of varying grandeur. They might be simple, they might be very large, very ornate. If we were to go to a graveyard, we would ourselves see that some graves have just a small simple cross or a small simple stone at the head of it. Others have angels, and they have large, practically like houses erected as memorials. So the poet then reminds us that a memorial is not really necessary. Once you're dead, you're dead. Nothing you do can awaken those who are dead. And he comes back once again to remind us that in death, all are equal. The paths of glory lead but to the grave, he says, and that's one of the most celebrated and most well-known lives in Thomas Gray's elegy, that the paths of glory, it doesn't matter how glorious your life is. You might have been the greatest person ever in terms of whatever your sphere of interest was. So the greatest poet, the greatest actor, the greatest footballer, you might be the greatest politician alive, you might have been prime minister, the father of the country. But the paths of glory lead but to the grave. In that sense, Gray's elegy or a country churchyard is also about the inevitability and the finality of death. That it comes to everybody, and when it comes, it's over. You're not going to then wake up, never mind how much people love you, how much people will put up these memorials for you. You're dead, you remain dead. Then, as we go on reading the poem, what we see is that once again he returns to the idea that just because they were from a village, just because they live in this rude countryside, as it calls it, it does not necessarily mean that they were people who were of no value, no worth. Instead, he says, some of these villagers might have had great potential. This is actually an idea that supposedly tells us that all people are equal, as in it depends upon the opportunities you have. So if the people in the village had better opportunities, they might have become far more successful, they might have been done greater things with their life than what they did because they lived in the village. And therefore then he says, perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, hands that the rod of empire might have swayed, or wake to ecstasy the living lyre. But knowledge to their eyes, her ample page, rich with the spoils of time, did ne'er unroll. Chill penury repressed their noble rage and froze the genial current of the soul. So there might have been, he gives you two examples as to what might have happened to, say, two people from the village. One might have been somebody who was an empire builder, who went out and built the British Empire. Or there might have been somebody who waked to ecstasy the living lyre, who might have become a great poet or a great musician. Now, he tells us that this also is possible amongst these people who live in the village. But he says there's something that comes in the way. And what is it, this that comes in the way? One, the fact that they do not have access to knowledge, to education. And two, that there is poverty on a grand scale. That poverty then represses them. That poverty chills their soul. Right? Poverty then is seen as then both as an oppressive structure, but also as something that renders people cold in the coldness of death. It freezes the genial current of the soul. That they will be eliminated because they were poor. This is something which we should, in our own context as well, think about, because what we are talking about is the fact that everyone has potential, but that potential, if it has to come to fruition, if it has to blossom, then they need to have knowledge, they need to have education, right? So the ample pages of education and knowledge should be unrolled before them. And two, they cannot be living in chill poverty, in penury, utter poverty where they cannot do anything. Then it's not possible for them to realize that potential. So it's lack of opportunity then which destroys people, not necessarily because they as people are seen as lesser than other people. And this then, he goes on to say that here also in this little village, in this village where he's standing in the country churchyard and he's talking, there might have been people like Cromwell and Milton from history who might then have been also in their time, they might have done the same kinds of things. Cromwell was empire builder, Milton was of course the greatest poet of the time, and therefore then in the village also there might have been people who had that kind of potential. So as we read, what we see is that even as Gray talks about what a village is like, the simple life of the village, the simple pleasures of the village, he also tells us about how the village or the rural lifestyle is such that it does not allow people to become what they might otherwise have become. So like Cromwell and Milton, the village folk also might achieve greatness, but for that they require similar chances, and those chances are not available to them. So as he puts it in the poem, what he says is, full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bear. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. If a flower is blooming somewhere and none of us can smell it, what difference does it make? And that's the idea that's given over here, that there are gems of great, precious stones of great beauty, great radiance, which are lying on the ocean floor. Not one of us will ever see them or enjoy their beauty. Similarly, the scent of flowers which bloom in the desert are not available to humankind. So there are, again, another aspect to what he's saying is that it's not necessary only to have opportunity. You also need to have appreciation. If nobody tells you that you are like a flower which is blooming and which is sending forth scent, are we ever going to grow? So human talent requires two things to grow. One is of course opportunity, and that opportunity can be given only if there is education and there is no poverty. The second is that if you have talent, that talent should be appreciated. People have to then see it and acknowledge it if we are to do something more with it. But, and now suddenly if you notice, Gray changes his tune completely. Till now, of course, he's been telling us that in the village it's like this, in the village it's like that, people don't really do such a great thing, can't do great things in their life. But he says, and here he suddenly steps back and he says, So if they didn't do great things, that's fine, because they also did not have the chance to commit great evil. And that's interesting, because what he's saying is that their lives are lives of mediocrity, though he's saying it in a much nicer fashion. They don't do anything startlingly great or good, but they don't do anything which is startlingly evil either. So he says their lot forbade, nor circumscribed alone their growing virtues, but their crimes confined. So they did not have the chance to perform unconfined crime, to go running around the world doing whatever nonsense they wanted. It forbade them to wade through slaughter to a throne and shut the gates of mercy on mankind. So if you go back to the example that he used, Cromwell in one sense spearheads the revolution in England and the Civil War, and he is responsible for killing many, including, of course, the king of the time. So when he says that it forbids the poor villager to wade through slaughter to a throne, he is then asking us to think of the fact that mediocrity or staying unknown in a village is actually in one sense not such a bad thing. The simple life of the village also prevents you from doing great crimes, from destroying civilizations, from showing no mercy to mankind. So neither do they become tyrants and wicked kings or rulers or empire builders, nor do they then achieve greatness. Then the second thing he says is that if they had been great poets, their poetic talent or whatever, their musical talent, their artistic talent would have to be sold, because all art is eventually also about earning a living through that art. So he says artistic talent, which would then have been commercialized. So therefore then these people did not then commercialize their talent, their gift. So their lives are seen as moderate and therefore beautiful. This is particularly important because if you think about it, this is a poet who's saying they didn't commercialize their artistic talent. It's also the kind of attitude which helps us to say that they're good, but they should remain where they are. Because if they remain where they are, then they do not form a threat to those who are doing other things. So in one sense, what we are doing is we are repressing what might have come out from there. We're telling them, you're leading good lives over there. Continue to lead those good lives, your small lives. Those are important, those are pleasant. And that way you will not do any great criminal acts, you will not commit evil. And it's better that you remain that way. That way also, they are stopped from becoming competition for those who are in the cities. So it's a form of repression that is being exercised via the poem itself. And as he goes on to say in the latter half of the poem, they remain far away from the ignoble strife of the madding crowd. And that phrase, that far from the madding crowd, which most of us are familiar with via Thomas Hardy's novel's title, comes from this. Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learned to stray. Along the cool, sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. They do not cause a ripple in the life of the larger population. And that is seen as a virtue. That is also, of course, a way of keeping them in their place. So it's a strategy of teaching the ordinary people that this is good for you, you stay this way. You will never then be competition to those who are in other places, those who might be doing greater things. You will also never share those benefits. So you are then emphasizing a kind of economy by which they are restrained to their own small sphere of activity, and they will not in any way threaten those who might have greater opportunities because they never turned up over here. Then, of course, he goes on to the idea of erecting memorials. Now, erecting memorials is something which comes over and over again within the poem. First of all, of course, when we start out with the idea in the title itself, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, we are talking about memorials in a country churchyard. Then when he talks about the fact that there are memorials even here in the churchyard, but these memorials are humble markers. They're little stones, small stones. They're nothing very grand over here, right? So it is then about the idea of how do you mourn somebody. And that's something which he does quite a lot with. One, of course, is the idea that nobody wants to live a life where he or she is not remembered in the afterlife. When you die, somebody should remember you, ideally. So therefore then, you put up a memorial stone. But is it only via a memorial stone that you will be remembered? Or is there something more that has to be done? Or is there something more by which you are remembered? Now, the elegy and the title itself, the elegy is a form of poetry, a lyric form of poetry, which is used to mourn the death of somebody. So you have very famous elegies in literature, and this is of course one of the most famous, but others include Lycidas, and then there is the Scholar Gypsy by Matthew Arnold as well. Now, the elegy itself begins with memorializing, one, the common people of the village. Two, via the common people, he begins to memorialize mankind at large, that everybody dies, everybody needs a memorial, and he is providing them a memorial in this poem. And then from the general, he comes down to the particular. The last three stanzas of the poem are an elegy for himself, because in that he writes his own epitaph, which will then, he believes, live on and memorialize him. So it works at various levels, what he is doing here within this poem. He is then memorializing not just from the particular, the country churchyard, he moves it outwards towards the larger population of the country, the world, if you will, and then from that larger population, he brings it right down to himself, and he memorializes himself. So the elegy mourns the death, the mortality of three sets of people. But in addition to mourning mortality, he also does something else. He celebrates mortality. He says that everybody will come to the grave. It does not matter whether you're great or whether you're humble, eventually what you end up with is death. So therefore, the commonality of death and the communality of death, that when you die, you are here, right? That even as he says there is no need for memorialization, he is memorializing. So there is this kind of paradoxical understanding which works within the poem, that he says there's no need to do it, but he himself is doing it, and he's doing it for himself in the future as well. That's one aspect to it. But also that he says, doesn't matter whether you're great. After having said that, if only they had lived in other places, they might have been great. He says it doesn't matter whether you're great or whether you're humble, eventually death will be common to all of you. Then of course, he also does something with the setting, because of the twilight setting, and twilight is when ghosts appear, twilight is when there is the shift between day and night, and therefore you are in an in-between space, and that in-between space is crucial to an understanding of the elegy also, because he also stands between life and death. In the midst of all that death which is around him, he is a marker of life. So the setting of the poem is also important, because it's set in a time and a place which marks it out as being a kind of marginal space or a threshold space. It's a space wherein you cross over from life to death. And this man who's standing here and speaking this poem is standing in that space and remarking about death and the consequences and the possibilities that death holds for this common people, even as he himself is of course firmly rooted in life. And towards the end, when he imagines this meeting of somebody who will come by and ask about him, he is again imagining that, because he has a section wherein he says that there'll be a guy who will come and ask people, where's the poet? And then he says, they will say that, oh, there was a guy like that, there was a poet, there was this man like this poet over here. But that man, he used to be very interested in nature, and he used to be always enjoying the beauties of nature, and he would be seen here and he would be seen there. But eventually, he was not seen for a couple of days, and then on the third day or second day, we saw his body being carried off to the churchyard. So if you think about it, the poet is also then positioning himself as moving from life to death. And in that death then, he then tells us how exactly he wants to be remembered. And later on, of course, we will come to the epitaph, which he will then read aloud. The person who asks those questions about the village, from the villagers, as to where is the poet, will then read aloud the epitaph. And this is what he says: here rests his head upon the lap of earth, a youth to fortune and to fame unknown. Fair science frowned not on his humble birth, and melancholy marked him for her own. Large was his bounty and his soul sincere. Heaven did a recompense as largely send. He gave to misery all he had, a tear. He gained from heaven, 'twas all he wished, a friend. No further seek his merits to disclose, or draw his frailties from their dread abode. There they alike in trembling hope repose, the bosom of his Father and his God. Interesting set of lines, because he takes us to the idea that he himself was humble. he himself was poor. Now, this, of course, is manifestly false, because we know that he wasn't a village man in that sense. Though he settled eventually in Cambridge, he was not a villager in that sense. He had gone on the grand tour, he had done several things, and he was not a poor man from a village, illiterate, chilled by penury, etc. But he imagines himself to be thus. So he is also then, of course, giving us a fictionalized report about himself. He is telling us a mythical story about himself. He says he was scholarly, but he was poor. He didn't really do anything very much, and he was unknown to fame. All of which are assertions which can be claimed to be slightly fictional. He was not unknown to fame. I mean, he was friends with Horace Walpole, one of the greatest names of the time. So he could hardly have been unknown. But, and then he goes on to the fact that heaven gave him a friend. And this is, of course, the reference to Richard West, whom is also supposed to be memorializing here in this poem. That he brings back the idea of living on, even when dead, because a friend remembers you. And he goes on to say that there is nothing that he wants from life, then that people should not probe into his merits or demerits, and instead God will be eventually the judge who will sit in judgment on them. Now, the poem as it is gives us, of course, the themes of mortality and morality, and this is where I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about the fact that mortality is final. But what he does with the idea of mortality is, even as he tells us that everybody dies, he also tells us that everybody is remembered after their death. And then he goes on. So he goes back and forth between these two ideas, that you will die. Once you are dead and it is final. But once you are dead, others will remember you. And how will they remember you? Then, of course, he goes back to the idea that because the villagers didn't do anything very remarkable with their lives, it doesn't matter, they will not be remembered as having been great, but they will not be remembered as having been criminally, evilly great either. So that's a good thing. But eventually, even as he seems to say that they don't need memorializations because they are dead and they are villagers, he also memorializes them. So through the poem there runs this kind of paradox, that even as he claims that you do not need a finite end to mortality, he also then says that it exists. So he says there is no need to do this, but he does it, even as he says so. Then he talks about the fact that life is actually bustling, and the first few stanzas, not the first three stanzas which set the mood, but the ones immediately after that, show us that bustling life of an ordinary individual, the things that they do every day. You go to work, you come back, your children are there around you, you talk to them, you talk to your wife, etc., etc. The small events of everyday life. Now, those are something which he sees as important, which he sees as essential, and which he sees as valuable. The villagers have a small, simple life that is important, that is good. But that small life also, of course, ends in death, just like the lives of the great end in death. So he talks about the community and he talks about being alone. And the graveyard is again symbolic, like it is symbolic of that passage from life to death. The graveyard is also important because of the idea of the community and the communal, and the idea of isolation. The poet alone is alive in the midst of a community, which is a community of death. Everybody there is dead, buried, and the names on the tombstones are also an indication of community, because they are all linked names. So you'll have three people who all share the same surname, who might be buried close to each other. And then you have this one person who is all alone, standing in the midst of a community of dead people, and he is isolated. So the poem gives us many of these contradictory ideas which are woven together by Gray, and which together then come to give us the elegy as something which is far more than its individual component parts, which we have examined in some detail. It is, of course, an elegy, as we have said repeatedly, at many levels. It mourns the people who are there, right there, buried in the graveyard, but it also mourns humanity at large, both those who are great, both those who live in the city, as well as those who are simple people, humble people who live in poverty in the villages. And then, of course, the elegy is an elegy for himself. And death is the leveler, death is the democratic note within the poem, that eventually it lays everyone low. Critical comments according to Dr. Johnson. Now, Dr. Johnson was a great admirer of the poem. He thought that it was something amazing, and he said that it finds a mirror in every mind. Everybody will like it. And that's actually true, because it has been read as something which everybody can respond to immediately and in similar fashion. Of course, there have been the other school of critics who've said that it is just full of common ideas and it doesn't really do anything very much. But it has also been read from a Marxist point of view, wherein the setting of the common villagers against the great people of the cities is seen as a move to let the common villagers know their station in life and abide in their station in life, thus posing no threat to the villagers. So today we looked at the Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray, and we read parts of the poem, but we also then talked about what exactly the poem does, the main themes of the poem, and how people have seen it variously as either reflecting the thoughts of every man or being just too full of cliches and truisms. You can read more about it in the document on the lesson. Thank you very much.